Oturum için sözü moderatörümüz Eda Arısoy'a bırakıyorum. Buyurun hocam.
Teşekkür ederim. First of all, I would like to welcome everyone. We are organizing the 5th International Symposium on Cinema and Philosophy, and the symposium expands and reaches new dimensions every year, which makes us extremely proud. In this sense, I would like to thank our symposium president, Professor Serdar Öztürk, once again for initiating and leading such a special organization. In this session, we welcome participants from different countries, and speeches will be made in the context of Gilles Deleuze, the most important name in cinema and philosophy that we are all inspired by. Actually, we have 3 speakers in this session, but one of the speakers is not connected yet. We will wait until the end of the session, and our first speaker is Boshko Karadjov. Hello, Mr. Karadjov. Can you hear me?
Yes, everything is okay.
Okay.
Hear you.
Okay.
Did you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, and I would like to introduce you in a few minutes before your speech. Boshko Karadjov is a professor of philosophy and scientific researcher. He has completed the postgraduate and doctoral studies in the field of epistemology, sociology and knowledge, normative methodology, and philosophy of science at the Faculty of Philosophy, SS Cyril, and Methodius in Skopje. For more than 15 years, he works as a teaching assistant in methodology of scientific research and political philosophy at the Faculty of Political Science and Faculty of Law and European University, as an assistant professor in epistemology and methodology of social and humanities research and political philosophy at the Institute of Social Science and Humanities Research, Euro-Balkan, Skopje, and as a teacher in philosophy and logic in high school, Koko Resin Velez. I'm sorry, by the way, for the possible defects in the pronunciations of the names. And your topic is the time-image cinematic treatment of duration and the concept of comic book time. And now I want to give you the word. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You have 15 minutes.
Okay. But I think that I have some technical problem. I listened to my voice. It's okay now?
We can hear you properly. If you don't have any technical problem, everything is okay here in the...
My voice, like I know it's okay. Okay, yeah. I will start.
Okay, please.
Thanks for your introduction. I'm philosophy professor 15 years, but in the several last years I started to work in comic book culture and in the philosophy and film research. And this is several years I'm very focused on some kind of different philosophical problematic than my first problematic in epistemology. And I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to address on this conference. And I'd like to share some of my thoughts about cinematic treatment of duration and the concept of comic book time. I don't know if you're familiar that the first film recording of Auguste and Louis Lumière, workers leaving the Lumière factory, and the first modern comic book, The Yellow Kid by Richard Outcault, appeared in the front of the audience in the same year, in 1895. And more specifically, films and comics are born in ethical historical moments. And exactly because of this, my research focus in this couple of years is focus in the impact that the knowledge and insights of film philosophy approach have on the theoretical consideration of graphic literature and comic book art. And my research is focused in this intermediate relation between philosophy of comics and philosophy of film. But let's start from the beginning. As probably you know, immoral and aesthetically questionable. And really the first significant theoretical book which rejects those derogative value proposition is Seven Lively Arts, probably you know from 1923, book by American writer and cultural critic Gilbert Silt. And in 1924, Gilbert wrote about American two greatest artists in the early 20th century. And for him, the first, the great American artist in the early 20th century was one, Charlie Chaplin, and the second was George Hermian. Probably most of you know his American cartoonist, best known for his comic strip Crazy Cat. And as you can see, comics and movies still go together. But after this, historically speaking, their path in the direction of aesthetic legitimization and theoretical and philosophical reflections goes in different directions. The film first built its own aesthetic legitimacy, but comic book art remained to fight for its aesthetic legitimacy for a very, very long period, I think until maybe 90s in the last century. For a long time, there was no theoretical interest in comic books and in graphic literature because of, my opinion, two very eminent scholars in the 50s. Two eminent scholars who had a very influential, devaluing position on every phenomenon in mass culture, including comics and including books. Those two scholars were, probably you know, the Frederick Bergman, a German-American psychiatrist who wrote very extremely influential book in '54, Seduction of the Innocent, and the American writer, film critic, social critic, and philosopher Dwight MacDonald, who was known by his very influential article, A Theory of Mass Culture, in 1953. And we don't have time here to go into the details because of our limited format, but those two authors labeled comic books as a dangerous kitsch literature directly responsible for the rise of the crime and juvenile delinquency in the United States in the 50s. And those two authors posed something that we recognize like anti-comic hysteria, radical campaign for prohibition of comic books, ceremonial burnings and public stigmatization. And all this resulted in the famous US Senate Subcommittee 1954 hearings of comic book publisher. However, after the 70s, after of emerging the underground comics, after the something that we call in comic book culture the British invasion in comics, and especially after publication of one great graphic novel in the 90s, the comic book Mouse by American artist Art Spiegelman. This comic probably you know received the prestige Pulitzer Prize for Literature, even it is a comic. The stigma towards the comic art was slowly and slowly overcome. But when the space for philosophical approach to comic art opened up, then a large number of theoreticians begin to explain media ontology of graphic literature and begin to explain aesthetic nature of comic book art with the help of the already established knowledge from the philosophy and theory of the film. In other words, this is my research point, in other words, a series of theoretical studies and series of philosophical approach start to define comic book art through the prism of aesthetic, visual and technical aspect of the film. And we call those philosophical approaches that use film as a model for understanding the media ontology of comic book art. I call them cinematic theory of comics. And this cinematic theory of comics starts from the interpretation that comic books and graphic novels are indeed cinematic phenomena. Why? Because the pictorial and the narrative elements in comics are structured in the framed, juxtaposed, proto-cinematic, deliberate sequence. One of the first cinematic theory of comics is that of the American great comic book artist and comic book theoretician, philosopher, probably you know, Will Eisner. And one of his first theoretical studies on comics, which was entitled Comics and Sequential Art, and Will Eisner together with film, together with animation, and together with storyboards in the so-called sequential arts. And it's quite okay because unlike painting, which petrifies motifs and creates a static image, comics and other sequential art like film, animation or storyboards, on the contrary, enable and makes dynamic and moving representation or sequence that appear to our perception in the form of connected squares and images. In other words, sequential art represent and create a movement image and time image. In other words, this approach, this is philosophical implication of this approach. In this approach, the being or the essence of the comic book art was born when we had, I call the reification of the first pictorial or first visual attempt to express the movement. And based on this, we can conclude that cinematic theories of comics, in a certain way, ontologically says that comics and films, including animated films, have an identical structural essence in this pictorial attempt to represent the movement image and to represent the time image. But, this is a crucial point, but with a remark, but very crucial remark, that in the film and in the animation, this type of representation is optically fused and mingled. And in comics, this type of representation is optically detached and fractured. However, we or I do not agree that the essence of comics is in this, how I call the chronotopic disunity. And we find that this interpretation of ontology of comics as an iconography of dynamism is problematic for several aspects, and I will try to answer why I think that. One of the reasons is that those cinematic theories of comics do not adequately explain the media ontology of graphic literature and not adequately explain aesthetic nature of comic book art. And moreover, this cinematic paradigm of defining comics does not at all legitimize comics as a separate, as an autonomous, or as an independent artistic discipline. What is the problematic in this cinematic theory of comics? If the difference between comic book art and film as an art form is only in the optical fused or optical detached representation of movement and time, then comic books and comic book art are nothing else but some sort of unfinished or unperfect film, some sort of unrealized film, some sort of semi-film, some sort of still not ecranized film, or maybe some sort of, probably if you remember Edward Murbridge chronophotography, some sort of chronophotography sequence. Nothing fundamentally, ontologically, naturally different from the film storyboards as a tool in film production. Or, as the British comic book author Alan Moore ironically points out, if we look at the comics through the prism of the film, then the most we can say about it is that comics are a movie that doesn't move. Movie that doesn't move. Precisely because of these problematic implications, I will try to analyze a different philosophical approach, through which I will try to illustrate something that I try to find, aesthetic uniqueness of comic as a separate and autonomous art. And we have one very interesting author, Scott McCloud. And what Gilles Deleuze means for philosophy of film with his book Cinema 1, a movement image, and Cinema 2, the time image. What Deleuze means for philosophy of film, Scott McCloud, this American theoretician and comic book artist, means for the philosophy of comics. Understanding comics, the invisible art, it's some kind of philosophy of comics equivalent in the value and point with the Gilles Deleuze books. Something, it's called the Gilles Deleuze philosophy of comics, this American author, Scott McCloud. And most of his remarks are the remarks that I take in account when we try to think about this ontological structure of comics and in films. In short, Scott McCloud explained this ontology of comic books by indicating its two essential features and call and response and comic book time. This short format, this 15 minutes format, doesn't allow me to talk in details about his first feature, the concept of closure, the ringing, rolling, closing, narrative gaps between the comic book panels. I will only stick into the second one. And what we think about comic book time and time image in comics and in difference with the time image in film. Film's ontology, or the essence of the film, allows it to reify the cinematic. In other hand, the ontology of comics cannot fully represent the moving image and the time image, and therefore, regardless of the inventive comic and graphic strategy for depicting the kinetic aspects of the motifs and themes in comics, it is not fundamentally the art of moving image, because the comic doesn't. On the contrary, comics as a medium of fixed pictorial iconography owns its duration. This is my hypothesis, owns its duration or time image to the aesthetic experience, to the reception itself. In the comic frame is a pictorial materialization of a certain moment or phase in the event, what we call in comic culture encapsulation, or kind of artistic exposure of the current state of the story as a petrification or fixation of certain moment. But this moment, or this petrified time image in one comic frame or in another comic frame is not identical. What I mean? In comic squares or in comic frame, we can express one time, let's call it T1 time, in assumed objective duration of maybe less of a second. For example, you can imagine a comic strip with a scene when we have a sword swinging, less than a second. But also in the comics we can find the time T2 in an assumed objective duration of perhaps maybe half an hour, when in the comic square, in the comic frame, we have a scene with the imagined protagonist facing maybe a life decision dilemma. That's why in comic book, this is my hypothesis, this is my point, in comic book art, the quantity of time, in the sense of time image, of duration, the quantity of time is equal to its content. The quantity of time is equal to its content. This means that a narrative play with time and disruption of objective time is not only possible, it's completely essential. When the comic frames are connected in the narrative line, it can be seen like the comics is basically a dramaturgical petrification of relatively shorter and relatively longer time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4, time 5, and time n, where n is time as duration of the in the sense of the very act of reading. What I mean by that? Time image in the comics is a kind of Bergsonian time. More specifically, the time is not the objective or expanded time, but a time that exists only in our experience during the reading of comics. At the moment of reading, comic book time begins to flow, but as our inner time, we, in our own consciousness, cognitively edit, rhythmically articulate, and temporalize the story according to our personal standard. And to conclude, what I think that in the film, the extent and character of time duration is determined by the author and materialized on the tape, on the screen, etc. But in the comics, the extent and character of the temporal duration is indicated in the comic panel. It's indicated, but left to temporal refinement by the reader's cognition. In the film, the measure and character of the time duration is a concrete and objective value, and in the comics is a subjective and cognitive variable. And I think that here is a very, very different ontological structure, and if we can prove this kind of difference, we can speak that comic books are autonomous artistic discipline. And this is something that I try to putting out and to explain. This is my short presentation. Thank you for your attention. thank you for possibility to participate and to speak something about this. Thanks.
Mr. Karadjov, thank you. I gave you some extra time, and I was ready to give a few minutes more because our third speaker didn't connect yet, but you used the time very well. Thank you very much. Probably we saved some time for the question and answer part. Okay, our second speaker is, I'm sorry for the pronunciation in advance because it's hard for me to pronounce your name. Lkhagvadulam, Purev-Ochir, probably you tell us the correct form, is a Mongolian writer and director. Welcome to the symposium, first of all. And I would like to introduce you for with a few words, sentences. Sorry. After graduating with an MBA in film direction, she interned at Mongolian National Broadcaster, where she trained under renowned Mongolian filmmaker Gigi Surengombaya. Sorry, she taught at the Mongolian School of Film, Radio and Television, as well as the Institute of Cinematography. She graduated with an MBA in Screenwriting from Kino Eyes European Filmmaking Masters in 2018. She's currently pursuing her PhD in Screenwriting. Her future debut project Z attended the Torino Future Lab 2021, where it won post-production grant, and Locarno Open Doors Hub 2020, where it won the production grant. And I see in your resume films, feature films, and also you have studied in 9 Eylül University, if I'm not mistaken. So your speech topic will be Screenwriting, the Time, Chronic Narration, and Pedro Costa's Cinema. We're listening to you.
Thank you, Eda. You are Eda, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for having me. I'm very happy to take part in this wonderful symposium that I've been following for the last couple of years online. So very happy to take part, very happy to be back in Turkey, even if it's virtually. Yes, and I mean, following the presentation by Mr. Karadjov, I'm quite embarrassed because I don't have all the academic merits that perhaps I should have. I'm actually more of a practitioner. I'm a filmmaker who is trying to understand what I'm doing, and therefore I continue my academic path. For the past 5 years, I've been studying screenwriting, and within this period, I've also been writing my own film. And actually, I shot my first feature film. I finished the shooting a couple of days ago, and therefore I'm very sick and tired, and it's a lot of things. So I apologize in advance if I start coughing. So yes, I come from this background where I'm, on a daily basis, I'm battling with myself as I write my film. And I say I'm battling myself because it's a really, really tough process. And I've been trying to understand this process and trying to maybe figure out a way or an approach that can perhaps make things a bit easier, because it's really, it's a draining process. I think if there are any writers out there, I think they will agree with me. At least I hope so. So basically, I think that as a writer, something that I've noticed is that there is a big difference between the film that is in my head and the film that is eventually being written on the paper. And I think it might sound funny to say, as a writer, that somehow the things that I'm writing is not what I want to write, even though I've written them. And the difference between what's in my head, the film that's in my head, and the film that's on the page, translated into words. Sorry, did I lose you guys? Or it's okay?
No, everything is fine. Please
Okay,
go on.
Sorry. So this difference is the reason why I'm kind of going into this research. As Eda had mentioned, while trying to make this film, I've gone through several different workshops like Script Lab, Feature Lab, Locarno Open Doors. I've also attended different writing residencies with the same script. So I've gone through a lot of different stages. I've gone through a lot of different developmental programs, etc. And all I can say is that I've come to the conclusion that the reason why there's such a difference between the film that's in my head and between the film that's on the page is because of the way we talk about writing or the way we talk about film. I feel like we're lacking a different set of vocabulary when we are talking about film. And this is where I think the time image comes into play. First of all, I'd like to, I'm sure many of you or all of you are Deleuze heads, so I don't have to explain anything, but I want to say that it's been very helpful to read Deleuze's books on cinema and to think of what an image is. Because an image, as a writer, you think, oh, we are storytellers, we are telling stories on the screen. But in fact, what is an image? As Deleuze says, image is thought. And if we think of camera as an artificial brain, then what we see on the screen is a series of thoughts. We are literally, as human beings, looking at the screen and watching ourselves think, listening to ourselves think. So I like this idea that an image, whether it's image or a sound image, is just our thoughts. And that's very helpful to me as a writer, because it tells me that I'm not trying to tell a story, I'm just trying to think. So if we approach filmmaking as just thinking, we're thinking, we're philosophizing, we're thinking on the screen. The second thing that was helpful for me to understand in this process of learning to be a writer is this distinction that Deleuze makes, which is movement image versus time image. Movement image is basically image where time is subordinated, time is manipulated, it's deconstructed and manipulated to serve the movement created by the action. So images are put in a linear development. Images are put next to each other. They have certain relationships. Mostly these relationships between the images are conflict-based. And time is completely broken down. So for example, an image of a person going into a car. The next image is a person going out of a car. And what happens is maybe the car ride was 30 minutes long, maybe the car ride was 1 hour long. We're breaking the time, we're deconstructing it and manipulating it to suit our purpose. The movement that's created on the screen is spatial. It's based on spaces and how we manipulate it. And this movement image, what Deleuze describes as movement image, corresponds very well to how we approach screenwriting nowadays, or maybe always. The classic approach to screenwriting has always been action. What is the action that's happening? What is the reaction? What is the resolution that's happening at the end of the film, or at the end of a scene? What's the resolution? What is the conflict within the scene or the sequence? It's very much about focusing on a character and trying to create a linear development of movement based on action, reaction, resolution. And it's very, it's quite bizarre that, you know, what Deleuze described as movement image is almost word by word fitting how we write classical films or classical approach to writing films. And this basically made me more curious to read about time image and how we can think of screenwriting in relation to time image in that case. So, how can we write the time image? Firstly, we have to approach it, I think, in terms of what it's not. Because time image is essentially the breaking down or the decomposition of movement image. What is happening in time image films is we have a character, but that character is no longer moving in a linear development fashion, with reacting to a situation and ultimately having a resolution to the action. In time image, we have a character who has no agency, a character who does not act, a character who has no power and cannot do anything. And this is very interesting because, generally speaking, when you study screenwriting or when you want to talk about your protagonist in the film, a lot of reactions from people are based on, you know, the character is very passive, the character doesn't seem to want anything, it's boring, it's not moving forward, etc. So these are very common reactions to screenwriting, to writing. But what Deleuze is saying is that, in fact, in time image, characters don't have the power. These are powerless characters. And all they can do is, in fact, just watch and walk. But in a lot of time image films, we have characters who are walking, who are rambling, wandering, who are looking at things, but they do not have any motor capacity to act, to react. So that is one aspect of time image. What else is happening in time image? First of all, the relationship between images are no longer there. Remember we talked about how relationship between images in movement image cinema is dialectical. You have image, you have reaction image, and then you have a resolution. What happens in time image cinema is that the images, they stand by themselves. They no longer depend on the images that come before them or the images that come after them in order to create meaning. The images are themselves, on their own, all alone, meaningful. And what that means is that, in fact, in time image, time is the most fundamental element in the image, in cinema. Because you are no longer breaking time and deconstructing it and to manipulate it in order to create a forward movement. All you have is, in fact, a pure sound and optical image where time flows by itself on its own. And you are able to experience time as a unit, and it has no relation to what comes before or after it. And I think this is also something that, you know, as writers we face a lot. We are told, how is this scene or is this shot related with any other shots? Why is this important? What is happening in this scene? Why is it not moving forward? But in fact, when you have a time image, you have an image that is able to purely be on its own. There is movement happening. It's not this linear forward movement that happens in action cinema. But what is happening is just being, just existence. Time is what's moving. So you have what is now generally people talk of as slow cinema, where the camera is just there and it allows things to. There's a lot of movement that's happening in the image. I think it's just a matter of understanding what is movement. Is movement comprised only of, you know, action, reaction type of linear development, Or are we talking about a movement that is whole on its own as an entity? And again, this is extremely helpful for writers to understand that in fact you don't need to be basing the shots, or at least the scenes that you're writing, relating it to anything else. It can just be that. It can just be, if you want, you can just write a tree in the middle of the field. And that's it. And there's movement in that. Of course, we have to discuss what else is in that, because internal movement is more than just what's kind of on the screen. So, first is the characters. Second is the relationship between the images in time and in cinema. The third thing I really want to mention is in time image cinema, spaces are completely disconnected and empty and irrelevant to the storyline. Usually in classic cinema, what happens is that as a writer, you have to really specify when a story happens, where it happens, and how it's relevant to the situation that the character finds themselves in. But in time image cinema, specificity is not important. The spaces are not important. In fact, in time image cinema, what tends to happen more is that spaces are completely shadowed. They're overwhelmed by shadows, so that specific connections cannot be made with reality. Reality basically is no longer important in time image cinema. A lot of the locations where you film, it's almost like they can be interchanged in a way that what's important is in fact the shadows and not the specificity of where the story is taking place. And I'm going to go into this a little bit more while talking about Pedro's cinema. So basically, space that was so important in movement image cinema, in classical screenwriting, becomes no longer relevant. Space is, I think there's a term for it, it's called any space whatsoever. It can be anywhere. The story can take place anywhere, unspecified. Because it's not about the specificity of location, it's more about imagery than about the emotion. So basically, in time image cinema, we also basically have these pure descriptions, pure optical and sound situations. Now, the reason why I'm talking and describing what time image is because these are extremely important concepts to think about. These are important vocabulary to have when we are writing. Because when we are writing a film, we don't need to, because one of the laws, one of the rules is you have to say where it's happening, when it's happening. But in fact, it's not that important. It's not important in time in cinema. It can be on the secondary stage is what I'm trying to say. So I'm just going to go into these concepts a little bit with Pedro Costa Cinema. I'm currently living in Portugal, but that is not the reason why I wanted to go into Pedro Costa Cinema a little bit. I do think, and I'm sorry if I sound a little bit
sorry for interrupting, but I will give you 5 more minutes. Our third speaker is online now because...
Okay. No problem. I'm just going to wrap up real quick then. Yes, so well, I do think Pedro Costa Cinema is hugely important in contemporary, in nowadays. I think he's one of the most important filmmakers of our time. And just to go into, for example, his latest film, Vitalina Varela, and to talk about this film in relation to the concept of time image, I think will be helpful in understanding how we should approach cinema. For example, Pedro Costa does not write a script. He basically collects images, ideas, words, anything that would be helpful to create not a story, but a pure optical sound image. That's all he's after. And basically, for example, Vitalina Varela is about a woman died, and she comes for his funeral. Unfortunately, she's late 3 days, and when she arrives in Portugal, her husband is already buried. And so the story is about a woman who is basically inhabiting the space that her husband used to inhabit. She's wandering in these very narrow, dark, shantytown streets. She's watching, she's listening to people talk about her husband. She's watching the different spaces. She's looking at items that her husband left behind. So again, this is not a character that you would conventionally think is a protagonist, the leading character of the film. In fact, she does nothing in the film. All she does is walk around, and there are different conversations that she's having with her husband, but her husband is gone. So she's speaking to space, almost in these monologue-like situations where she's kind of speaking to off-screen. And this, again, even though the story is taking place in 2020 Portugal, you would never know that this is Portugal. Because again, the specificity of the milieu, the location is not important in the film. In fact, what is important is to completely overshadow it, to infuse things with shadows so that it becomes any space whatsoever. It becomes more of an emotional landscape. The film is no longer about 2020's Portugal. It's really just about mental space, the mental space of saying goodbye to a husband. And it's about a spiritual space. And so this is what I'm actually trying to say as a writer. It's really difficult to put these words into expression, because maybe we are not trying to tell a story about a person and a place and an event. Maybe we're just trying to express a spiritual state of being. And the time image, Deleuze's time image, is really, really, in my opinion, helpful in trying to express these ideas. I think I've run out of time, so Eda, I feel
exactly. I was about to interrupt you.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope I didn't ramble. I hope it makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you for your valuable speech, Mrs. Ochir. And our third participant is Edgaras Bolsakovas. Hello, Mr. Bolsakovas. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? We can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Hello.
Welcome to the
Nice to
symposium. I will just shortly introduce you. You are working as an advertising copywriter, and you are attending from Lithuania. And you are, I think, you are working on film critics and film reviews in a journal named, it's hard for me to pronounce it, but I'll try, Literatura Irmenas Journal. And if I'm not mistaken, you are a PhD student still, because it says current in your information. PhD of Philosophy, Vilnius University. Okay, it's a short introduction, but now we're listening to you, and your topic is an alternative way of making Deleuzian film history. Please, word is yours.
Yes, thank you. So, the biography, that the self-made PhD students, they have to work. So, but in general, my life mostly goes around philosophy, particularly film philosophy. And yes, I'm studying in Vilnius University, the capital. I'm trying to share my screen. Is it working?
We can see your screen, yes.
But it's the slides or the camera?
We can see the presentation now, only the presentation.
Okay, thank you. So just before starting, I want to thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to see you guys. The topic of my talk is an alternative way of viewing developing film history. It's important to have this distinction when we start about history, because still, history is not philosophy. So we have to see the relationship there. We have to take the classical distinction in film history studies. It's from a quite Marc Ferro, quite known cinema historian, French. When cinema is divided as a historical source or as a historical agent. So I think it's quite intuitive and easy to understand what they're speaking about. One way of seeing film is as a material or ideological data that you can interpret it. So it means that you see some kind of material heritage, you see the way people talk or think back in the days, and generally it means that cinema is an illustration of past, the reality that already passed. The second one is a historical agent. Cinema is a historical agent. It means that cinema itself works as a material historiography. So it portrays history in a conscious manner. It does usually what is considered philosophers of history do. How should history should be perceived, how it should be written or filmed. So having this distinction, we can try to align them with the laws both. So of course, the movement image, as I wrote here, is a historical agency in cinema in itself. It creates a particular way, an autonomous way, different from the written history, of image of history. Here's the example that I gave is about Eisenstein. We know his motto of making film, that it's a shock to your brain. So all the films that he did, Strike or Potemkin, was more or less in order to awaken the class consciousness in the proletariat. Either it can be, so Eisenstein, he explicitly says that in his writing work, but again, what Deleuze shows us in his books is that movement image cannot be so easily interpreted as a historical source, because it always gives its particular way of seeing historical reality. So that example that I gave is how he interprets the German expressionism films of the Weimar period in Germany, and how it's a continuation but also a different way of thinking romanticism. Maybe a good reminder would be that there's a third part of images that Deleuze referred in one of his interviews. It's called image of movement, or just image movement. So this is something that you're seeing now, right? This is the camera filming my face now. It's not a movement image per se. It's just an image that has a movement. So the most basic moved images, he calls it a phenomenological way of seeing So of course it's, for him it's boring, and that's why he doesn't speak about it in the cinema books, but you can find in his works that he refers to this kind of images. It's just plain the moved image without the autonomous quality of cinema. And then the second part is the time image, which is ahistorical. So the time image is the philosophical part of the game here, because you cannot reduce it to historical reality. Because what it shows, as already a lot of times has today been repeated, is time itself. The distinction here I made, sorry, I have to apologize for everyone who's working with the Deleuzian philosophy. I know that you're fed up with this Bergsonian cone, but just to clarify, so we have the S plane here, which is actuality, right? The reality that is actualized from the virtual one. So history is the S plane, and time, which is time image, is the cone itself. I made it, maybe there's a few people who didn't see it, so I made it read up for them. This is very, very popular image, so everyone who's working in Deleuze, of course, has seen it. And the second part, so this is where philosophy comes in Deleuze works. So A, it's the ontology of person, which actually answers the question, like, what is cinema? So by using person dictionary, Deleuze is able to show that it's ahistorical. Like this ontology of time and the way it actualizes is an ahistorical structure. That's what makes distant from historical. But the second one, and to be honest, quite a neglected part of this project, is the Pearson part. So the second question, if Bergson helped him to answer what is cinema, the second question that is important for him is to show how does it function. And here's the Pearson, Charles Sanders Pearson part important, which is seen more or less. We can see that in the reception part of the Deleuzian philosophy, the Pearson part is not that widely discussed. The two most important parts is that the signification process, of course this is a bit alien term, but let's just say, let's stay with the Pearson, the signification part never ends. So that's why I've written here object, sign, interpreter, object, and left it 3-dot mark, because it's a continuous movement. There's never a stable identity of meaning. So object is changed by sign, then it's changed by interpreter, and again the circle goes. So it's like, you can see here a sense of becoming, and never of being. So that's why Deleuze likes it, but also he has a fourth dimension. So object, sign, and interpreter, sometimes Peirce refers to it as firstness, secondness, and thirdness. And Deleuze adds the fourth dimension is zero-ness. It's that the human consciousness is a void. There is also a popular saying, probably a lot of people know, that the human brain is a screen. So in a sense, that's how he goes from the actuality part of the reality, which is historical, that's how he connects with the Bergsonian ontology of time through this additional sign, zero-ness, which is actually human consciousness. So we distinguished the philosophy in the books, which is not always very easy to do. A lot of people see it in very historical terms. But that's the tricky part here of the Deleuzian project. I wrote here the three, in my idea, the three strategies how one can understand the reception of the Deleuzian work. I will not read it loud, I think you can see it pretty clearly. What interests me here, in my opinion, is the most potential and interesting strategy of reception is the third one, applied history. And I think most people are quite accustomed to that. that way of doing Deleuzian film philosophy is that you take those concepts and you apply it to movies that Deleuze didn't reference in his books. One has to be quite honest that he was a very Parisian cinephile, right? So the books, the films that mostly he refers are European ones, and especially French ones. So yeah, I think that's the most interesting part that can be worked, his legacy. But
Mr. Bolsakovas, I'm sorry, your last 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to be short here.
Thank you.
I wrote the advantages here of why Deleuze is quite popular in the reception. But as you see, again, sorry for the call, the way that first paradigm is done, which we can call decolonial paradigm, right? So again, we know that time images liberating is anti-colonial, anti-biological, etc., etc. But usually what people do when they do this applied history is they put a line here, as I've written, this line of history, and they show the secret or not so widely expressed identity of various world cinemas. I think the talk that was before by David Martin Jones, so he's doing a lot of that work, right? He's showing the hidden histories of cinema and how cinema is done. But the problem with that, there's two problems actually. I call them dogmas. The problem with that is that kind of strategy refers to the semantics of cinema. And the Deleuzian system of science is a syntax, it's not semantics. What does it mean? It means that can one say about liberating properties of a sign if that sign is a noun? So the analogy here works with language, right? We have a language, and there is not, it doesn't matter what kind of word, but it's a noun. Is this a part of noun? So itself, it has no content. The same way, in a similar way as a time image. So to answer that question, it does only have liberating properties, decolonial or other kind of properties, only if you have some kind of political or historical understanding of the context. So a noun itself would work in a semantical way if, let's say, you live in a dictatorship run by Heraclitus. So the analogy here is that if the common sense is that everything is becoming and there's no fixed identities, everything is like Heraclitean flux. So at that moment when someone proposes a noun, which is a small and stable identity, then it becomes meaningful as a sign, as a part of syntax, which already automatically implies some kind of meaning. And the second part is here, the problem is about the Bergsonian ontology. Actually, the feminist critique of the Deleuzian film philosophy project has shown quite well that becoming itself, when you go to the end, it deletes all kind of identities. So while it's easy to use the loss, and we know that it's already done, to show how, let's say, machistic or patriarchal film works, in the end, what happens is that identity as itself, feminine identity, loses its structure. So become the only process that happens is becoming. And to be honest, I think that not a lot of people, especially when who works in post-colonial regions, they are so easily can say that we are becoming, they're not able or want to lose their identity. It's not something to be ashamed of, right? So these two dogmas, these two problems, is my proposition is to have more explicated reception theory. And we can do that by using Cavell's, by adopting a Cavelian point of view. What he did, he proposed, while he started his film philosophy, and we know that he was a bit earlier than Deleuze, is that there's a particular problems that film can try to solve. So in Cavell's point of view, as philosophy got too much Europe, too much anglicized, you see that American philosophy lost its unique touch, it became too much as European philosophy. The work of national philosophy was taken over by film. And film explicated like this particular authentic ethical mode of American way of life, what he calls moral perfectionism. So while that is, I think that's quite easy to understand, the solution is particular, but the problem is universal. And that problem is skepticism. That you don't agree with the basic and, the grand narrative of how technology should be done. A small example here I give is a shot from Lithuanian film back in the Soviet Union. It's called Chronicles of a Day. And we have a parallel montage here. So on the right you have a contemporary guy, on the left you have a Bolshevik revolution warrior, soldier, who is implying that the contemporary people are conformist. They lost their integrity and they don't have ethical values anymore. So, in a sense, for someone who doesn't know the particular context, it's not understandable. But the context is here is the Marxistic, the Marxian philosophy of history. That history has a law, it progresses, and it progresses by becoming better and by the rule of workers. So having a shot of a warrior 50 years ago showing to the contemporary person that he is implying that you lost your ethical integrity, it implies that Marxistic philosophy of history is wrong. So of course this film was banned, censorized back in '63. But
sorry for interrupting, but we exceeded time. Probably last few sentences. Then I have to ask to the audiences for the question and answer.
Yes, understood. So, of course, this is not a time image. This is purely movement image. The parallel montage doesn't create a time image, but still, there is some minor cinema aspect here. Yeah, this is possible counter-arguments, so I will not engage them because of the time. Also the main idea is that while doing Deleuzian film philosophy, one has to have a clear sight of balance. In the sense that one should not become a dogmatic Deleuzian and only use those terms and see that they're ahistorical, that the tools Deleuze gave us, moment, movement, image, and time image, but also while expressing, as there was a citation here, expressing a view that there can be 1,000 ways of time image, that there can be hybrid images, one loses the respect to the legacy of Deleuze. So it's a thin line when one has to work, because then what we liked about Deleuze is that he didn't use cinema only to illustrate his philosophy, right? He treated cinema as an autonomous piece of culture. So the same what happens now in the reception after almost 50 years of Deleuze works, one can see that the same respect that Deleuze gave to cinema is not given back to his work. The tools that he gave us are becoming too much extended and they're losing their meaning. So that was my point here in this talk. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Bolsakovas. for your speech. It was very valuable. I want to ask to the audiences if we have any questions to the speakers. Yes, we have one question.
Hi there, can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks to all the speakers, very interesting talks. I have a question for Ms. Purev-Ochir, second speaker. Very interesting to hear from a practitioner. I just wondered, I was interested in your description of, if you like, the film school, screenwriting, educational establishment, always pushing you in the direction of the movement image and of kind of logical connections between scenes and motivations and so on. I just wondered, it seems that you yourself are interested in making a film which is much more focused on the time image, and as a practitioner, do you feel that that is easier or more difficult today in terms of arranging production and distribution of your work than it was for the likes of Antonioni and Pasolini and the great kind of directors of the past? Thank you very much.
The lady wrote in the Zoom chat that she has to take care of her child. So I'm not sure if she can answer it.
Sorry, it's not clear.
In the Zoom chat, the lady wrote that she has to take care of her child and that she cannot attend the Q&A.
Okay. So any other questions? One more.
Yeah. Yes, you can hear me. That's good. My question is to Boshko. While I was reading, while listening and trying to understand what you are telling, by the way, I agree with you. In comic books, time frame is personal, and I'm sure it's changed from person to person. Is that time limitation or time frame? What I was wondering myself that, sorry, so to Bolshko, yeah. Why I was wondering whether I was reading any comic books last 10 years, 20 years. I cannot even remember reading comic books last 30 years. What happened to comics books, and will they come back? Thank you.
Sorry, I have a problem with audio in the last part of your sentence, and I have a disruption sound that I didn't hear.
Here's
the last part of the questions. The last 10 years?
I've been not reading comic books last 10, 20, 30 years. Question myself why I have been not reading, and what happened to comics books? Are they still exist?
It's a nice, very nice question. They still exist, and they overcome that kind of stigma. And like in every art, we have comic books that are masterpieces of the art, and we have normally comic books who are very low in quality and very similar to the beginning of the comic book industry. It's like in every art today. We have a very good masterpieces, and we have also this commercial comic books, etc. I don't know what I will recommend you. It's maybe we have a different production. We have a Franco-Belgian school, and we have Italian and Spanish Euro school. We have the Japanese school of comic book production, and we have also the American school, which was divided into superheroic comic books and underground or alternative comic books. And yes, they still exist. I think that in Turkey is very popular Italian comic books still, and Italian comics. There is a very interesting masterpiece in the 90s. The last good graphic novel that I was read is The Blue Pills, Frederick Peters, some kind of graphic memoir, and another different type of expression. I think that now in the comic book culture, we speak much more about the graphic novels. And when we find this term, we think that this is some kind of very aesthetical and artistic type of comic book expression. And when we use some kind of other term like comic books or comic strip, we often mean by not so artistically and not so aesthetically engaged comic books. And today is a very significant graphic novels that was on the same level as the fine art.
To all the speakers, thank you for your thank you for attending and for your inspiring speeches. Hope to meet you again. I think we're end of the session.